The 1970s produced some of the greatest music ever made, but it also produced records that crashed and burned in ways nobody saw coming. Some were too strange, some were too soon, and some were simply misread by everyone who heard them. So today we're counting down 10 songs from the 1970s that flopped for a reason. Number 10, Revolution by the Beatles, 1968, significant through early 1970s. When the Beatles released Revolution as a single in August 1968, the expectation among many of their fans was that the band would use their enormous platform to take a clear, unambiguous political stance in favor of the radical movements sweeping the world that year. Instead, John Lennon wrote a song that expressed skepticism about violent revolution and called for personal, internal change over collective political action. The message was cautious, measured, and deeply unwelcome in certain quarters. The left-wing political press, particularly in the United States and the UK, reacted with open hostility. The New Left Review published a critical analysis. Ramparts magazine ran a piece attacking Lennon personally for what it characterized as a betrayal of the generation's political aspirations. Activists who had expected the Beatles to be on their side felt instead that the song was a lecture from above telling them their methods were wrong. The irony is that Revolution was not actually a commercial flop. It reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the B-side Hey Jude became one of the biggest singles of the year. But Revolution underperformed relative to what a Beatles A-side was expected to do in 1968, and in the years immediately following its release, it was discussed more as a political disappointment than as a musical achievement. The slower, more contemplative album version on the White Album, also called Revolution 1, was similarly argued over rather than embraced. The song that Lennon had intended as a genuine philosophical statement about change became, in the climate of 1968, evidence of the limits of what popular music could say without alienating half its audience. It was a lesson in what happens when an artist tries to be honest about complexity in a moment that demands simplicity. Number 9, Back Off Boogaloo by Ringo Starr, 1972. Ringo Starr released Back Off Boogaloo in March 1972 at what should have been a favorable moment for him commercially. His solo career had genuinely impressed people. It Don't Come Easy from 1971 had reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 in the UK, demonstrating that one of the 4 former Beatles could hold his own as a solo performer. The follow-up single had the full weight of that momentum behind it. Back Off Boogaloo reached number 9 in the UK and number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 as well. Numbers that look respectable on paper but represented a step down from It Don't Come Easy, and the song quickly disappeared from public consciousness in a way that his previous single had not. The reasons were several. The song's title was built around Boogaloo, a slang term associated with a dance style that was already dated by 1972, which made it feel slightly behind the curve before anyone had even heard it. The lyrical content was vague and playful, in a way that charmed some listeners and frustrated others. There was speculation at the time that it was directed at Paul McCartney, which Starr denied, and the ambiguity made the song harder to connect with emotionally than a more direct piece of material would have been. The production, handled partly by George Harrison, was competent without being distinctive in the way the best recordings of the era were. Harrison's influence was present but not as sharply defined as on It Don't Come Easy, where his contribution had helped give the record a musical identity that felt specific and memorable. Ringo Starr had genuine charisma and genuine warmth as a performer, and his best solo work demonstrated both of those qualities consistently. Back Off Boogaloo caught him in a moment where the material was lighter than his talent deserved, and the result was a record that sold reasonably well on the strength of his name and the memory of his previous single, disappointed the people who had loved It Don't Come Easy and vanished from radio rotation with unusual speed for a record by a former Beatle. He recovered fully from the stumble. His next project, the album Ringo in 1973, was genuinely successful and featured contributions from all three of his former bandmates. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison each contributed material or performance, making it the closest thing to a Beatles reunion record that existed at that point. The album demonstrated what Ringo at his best could accomplish. Back Off Boogaloo, by contrast, became a footnote in his solo discography, a record that most people who know Ringo Starr's career have either never heard or remember only vaguely, which is perhaps the most honest way a commercial disappointment can resolve itself. Number 8. The Genie by David Bowie, 1972. A note before the full story. The Genie was not a flop by conventional chart standards. It reached number 2 in the UK and number 71 in the United States. The flop in this case was specific to the American market, and understanding why requires understanding what David Bowie was up against in late 1972. The song was released in November of that year, during the height of his Ziggy Stardust period, and the Ziggy persona, androgynous, alien, theatrical, deliberately unsettling to conventional gender expectations, was precisely calibrated for the British cultural moment and precisely wrong for American mainstream radio in 1972. American radio programmers in 1972 were navigating a market still dominated by the soft rock and country-influenced sounds that had defined the early part of the decade. James Taylor, Carole King, and the entire singer-songwriter movement had established an expectation of personal, intimate, acoustic-influenced music that felt like the exact opposite of everything Bowie represented. Glam rock had not established any meaningful foothold in the United States the way it had transformed the UK market, and Bowie's entire visual and sonic presentation was alien to the format of the stations that controlled access to mass American audiences. The Genie is a hard-rocking, blues-influenced track that sits on a relentless guitar riff borrowed from the Bo Diddley beat, the same rhythmic foundation that had powered decades of rock and roll before it. In a different cultural climate, it would have found a home on American FM rock radio without significant difficulty. In the specific climate of late 1972, it was too strange, too British in its references, and too visually confrontational to separate from the image of the person making it. American programmers could not play the record without implicitly endorsing everything Bowie represented, and in 1972, they were not prepared to do that. Bowie eventually cracked the American market, but it took until Fame in 1975, a song he co-wrote with John Lennon, carrying the implicit endorsement of an American rock legend. The 3 years between the Genie and Fame represent one of the stranger gaps in 1970s music, a period when one of the most critically celebrated artists in the world was releasing records that British audiences embraced completely, and American radio largely pretended did not exist. Number 7. Sail Away by Randy Newman, 1972. Randy Newman's Sail Away, the title track from his 1972 album of the same name, is today recognized by music critics as one of the greatest American songs of the 1970s, a dark, complex piece of writing that satirizes the mythology of America by presenting the case for slavery in the language of an 18th century ship captain recruiting African people with promises of a better life. The song is a devastating piece of irony, using the musical vocabulary of optimistic Americana to expose the lies at the foundation of the country's self-image. It received virtually no commercial attention upon release. The album reached number 163 on the Billboard 200, barely registering. The single was not a significant chart presence. Radio stations had no idea what to do with it. The song's satirical approach was so complete, so committed to its fictional narrator's perspective, that many listeners who encountered it without context were genuinely unsure whether Newman was writing a pro-slavery song or a critique of slavery. That ambiguity, which is precisely what makes the song great as a piece of art, made it essentially unplayable on commercial radio in 1972, where a programmer could not afford to spend 3 minutes explaining the satirical framework before the record started. Newman was not surprised by the commercial failure. He had built his career on exactly this kind of writing. Songs that required the listener to understand that the narrator was not the author, that the point of view being expressed was the target of the satire rather than the author's genuine position. That approach worked in the context of an album, where the full body of work provided the interpretive context. As a single without that context, Sail Away was simply too difficult and too disturbing for mainstream consumption. The album of the same name went on to be recognized as a masterpiece of American songwriting. It appeared on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Music writers who have examined the 1970s in detail consistently rank it among the decade's most important records, and virtually no one bought it when it came out. Newman's situation in the early 1970s, critical admiration inversely proportional to commercial success, is one of the more instructive stories of an era that was simultaneously open to experimentation and commercially indifferent to the results. Sail Away flopped not because it was bad, but because it was too good, too complicated, and too honest for the market to know what to do with it. Number 6. Heroes by David Bowie, 1977. Heroes is today universally considered one of the greatest songs of the 1970s, perhaps of the entire rock era. Its reputation is so completely established that it is easy to forget how the record was received at the time of its release in September 1977. The single reached number 24 in the UK, which was a modest position for an artist of Bowie's stature at that point. In the United States, it reached number 116, almost entirely off the commercial radar. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. The song arrived in the middle of the punk moment in the UK when the critical and cultural conversation had moved decisively away from the elaborate studio production and concept-driven work that characterized Bowie's Berlin trilogy with Brian Eno. The music press, and which was enormously influential in shaping public taste in 1977, had largely decided that complex, atmospheric art rock was part of the old order that punk was displacing. Publications that had celebrated Bowie through the early and mid-1970s were now championing The Clash and the Buzzcocks, and Heroes did not fit the story those publications wanted to tell about where music was going. The song itself is a dense, layered, emotionally complex piece of work. Producer Tony Visconti developed an innovative guitar sound with Robert Fripp, who played 3 distinct guitar parts that were recorded with specific mic placement to create an ambient effect that had not previously been used in mainstream rock recording. Bowie's vocal was recorded in 3 passes at progressively greater distances from the microphone, creating a dynamic quality that builds across the song's length. These were technically ambitious choices that produced something genuinely unprecedented, and that also made the record difficult to categorize for radio programmers working in formats that required instant accessibility. In the United States, Bowie's audience had not yet fully recovered from the years during which his records had been too visually and musically confrontational for mainstream radio. Heroes reached its American audience through critical praise and word of mouth rather than radio exposure, which meant its reputation built slowly and without the immediate commercial validation that chart success would have provided. The song grew in stature over years and then decades, used in films, in advertising, at sporting events, at moments of genuine public emotion, until its original chart performance came to seem almost impossible to believe. It is one of the clearest examples in 1970s music of the gap between what the market rewarded in the immediate moment and what time eventually decided was worth keeping. Number 5. Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft by The Carpenters, 1977.
Calling occupants of interplanetary craft.
The Carpenters were one of the most commercially successful acts of the early 1970s, with a string of chart-topping singles that made Karen Carpenter's voice one of the most recognized sounds in popular music worldwide. By 1977, the cultural landscape had shifted considerably, and the soft, polished sound that had made them dominant in the early part of the decade was somewhat out of step with where popular music had moved. Punk had arrived, disco was at its commercial peak. The carefully crafted, emotionally direct ballads that were the Carpenters' core strength occupied a middle ground that was increasingly difficult to find an audience for. The decision to record Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft, a song about making contact with extraterrestrial life, originally recorded by the Canadian group Klaatu in 1976, was an attempt to demonstrate a willingness to take creative risks and step outside the familiar parameters of their sound. The Carpenters' version is genuinely ambitious. It runs to over 7 minutes in its full album form and builds to an orchestral arrangement that is unlike anything else in their catalog. Producer Richard Carpenter, Karen's brother and creative partner, took the project seriously, and the recording is technically accomplished. The song was released in the UK in September 1977, where it reached number 9, a respectable showing that suggested there was an audience for this kind of experiment, at least in the British market. In the United States, however, it stalled significantly below the positions that the Carpenters' earlier singles had occupied on the Billboard Hot 100. The core Carpenters audience, which had loved them precisely for the intimate, emotionally direct quality of songs like Close to You and We've Only Just Begun, found the song's science fiction subject matter and elaborate production disconnected from what they had come to expect. New listeners who might have been attracted by the more ambitious approach were not the people who had historically bought Carpenters records, and the crossover that Richard Carpenter was attempting to engineer did not materialize. There was also a specific timing problem. 1977 was the year of Star Wars, and public interest in space themes was genuinely high. But that interest was being served by science fiction cinema rather than by orchestral pop songs about interplanetary communication. The record exists in the Carpenters' catalog as a genuine anomaly, a sincere creative gamble that the market declined to reward.
Calling occupants of interplanetary craft.
Number 4, Goin' Places by the Jackson 5, 1977. By 1977, the Jackson 5 were navigating a period of genuine commercial difficulty. They had left Motown Records in 1975 and signed with Epic Records, a move that generated significant industry attention but produced mixed results in the marketplace. The album Goin' Places, released in October 1977, and its title track single represented one of the more visible stumbles of that transitional period. The album reached number 52 on the Billboard 200, and the single performance was similarly underwhelming for a group that had placed multiple number 1 singles during their Motown years. The reasons were layered. The group had aged out of the teen pop market that had made them famous, but had not yet fully established themselves as a credible adult act. The sound on Goin' Places was caught between the straightforward pop soul of their Motown period and the disco-influenced direction that Epic was encouraging, and it satisfied neither audience fully. Fans who remembered I Want You Back and ABC found the material less immediate. Listeners who were following the disco moment had Donna Summer and the Bee Gees to choose from. The broader Jackson story was also in a complicated place in 1977. Michael Jackson had released his first solo album Off the Wall. No, that came in 1979. In 1977, Michael was appearing in The Wiz on Broadway, and the group's collective profile was being maintained by live performances and television appearances, as much as by their recorded output. The Goin' Places album represented the group at a moment of transition that hadn't yet resolved into a clear direction, and the market responded accordingly. Within 2 years, Michael's solo breakthrough on Off the Wall in 1979 would change the trajectory of everything. But in 1977, Goin' Places was the sound of one of the most talented families in popular music, trying to find where they fit in a landscape that had moved on from where they had started. Number 3, From Me to You by the Beatles, US release 1963. From Me to You was the third Beatles single released in the UK, where it reached number 1 in April 1963 and spent 7 weeks at the top of the charts, making it one of the most successful British singles of that year. In the United States, however, the story was completely different. The song was licensed to VJ Records and released in May 1963, where it failed to chart at all in any meaningful way. The same song that was number 1 in the UK was essentially invisible in America. The reasons were structural rather than musical. In 1963, British pop music had almost no foothold in the American market. The BBC's domestic dominance meant that British artists were commercially significant in the UK without generating any corresponding international awareness. American radio programmers in 1963 had no framework for processing British rock and roll. The format was dominated by domestic artists, and the assumption that anything worthwhile in popular music would come from America was so embedded in the industry that British records were treated as novelties at best. VJ Records, which held the license for Beatles material in the United States, was a small independent label without the promotional infrastructure to break an unfamiliar foreign act. The failure of From Me to You in America in 1963 is part of the larger story of how the Beatles' American breakthrough eventually happened, not organically through radio play, but through the combination of Capitol Records' heavy promotion and the Ed Sullivan appearance in February 1964. When I Want to Hold Your Hand finally broke through, it retroactively created an American market for everything the Beatles had previously released. VJ re-released their earlier catalog and suddenly had American hits on their hands. From Me to You charted in the United States in 1964, but only because the conditions that had caused it to flop in 1963 had been completely reversed by events that nobody, including the Beatles, had fully anticipated. Number 2, Golden Years by David Bowie, 1975. Golden Years was released as a single in November 1975 and represents one of the more puzzling commercial disappointments in Bowie's 1970s output. The song reached number 8 in the UK, which was solid but unremarkable for an artist who had previously reached number 1. In the United States, it performed better than most of his previous American releases, reaching number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100. But in the context of what Bowie was creating at this moment, the response still felt underwhelming. The issue was partly one of timing and partly one of audience expectation. Golden Years arrived at the beginning of what would become the station-to-station era, a transitional period in which Bowie was moving away from the glam-influenced work that had made his reputation and toward the colder, more electronic sound that would define the Berlin albums. The song itself is a sophisticated piece of blue-eyed soul, drawing on the sound of late-period Motown and Philly soul, and it features some of the most controlled and nuanced vocal work Bowie ever committed to record. The audience that had loved Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane found it too smooth, too polished, and too far from the theatrical rock that had defined their relationship with Bowie. The audience that might have embraced the soul influences was already well served by actual Motown and Philadelphia International artists and had limited reason to seek out a British art rock singer working in a borrowed idiom. Golden Years fell between two audiences rather than fully capturing either one, and the result was a record that chart watchers at the time registered as a minor disappointment, even as its reputation has improved steadily in the decades since. Number 1, In My Life by Billy Preston, 1974. Billy Preston's 1974 album Everybody Likes Some Kind of Music contained a recording of John Lennon's In My Life, the beloved Beatles track from the 1965 album Rubber Soul that Preston approached with genuine musical ambition, reworking the arrangement into a soul gospel setting that suited his extraordinary keyboard skills and warm vocal style. Preston was, at this point in his career, a significant figure. He had played keyboard on the Let It Be sessions and received the remarkable credit The Beatles with Billy Preston on the Get Back single in 1969. He was respected by everyone in the music industry. The recording did not chart. It received minimal radio attention. The reasons were partly practical and partly a reflection of the climate surrounding Beatles-related material in the mid-1970s. The dissolution of the Beatles was still a raw subject for much of their audience, and recordings that revisited their catalog, particularly a song as emotionally weighted as In My Life, faced an audience that had very specific feelings about the original. Preston's version was not a pale imitation. It was a genuinely different and serious artistic statement. But the audience that might have appreciated it most was the same audience most likely to feel protective of the original recording. And that protective instinct worked against the cover, finding a commercial foothold. Preston continued recording through the 1970s with varying commercial success, and his keyboard work as a session player on records by everyone from the Rolling Stones to George Harrison ensured his professional reputation remained strong. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more music content like this.